Listen, for a moment, to the sound of waves against stone. Can you hear them? That rhythmic crash and whisper as water meets ancient rock somewhere far in the north. Beyond that, listen deeper still. There is a crackling, the gentle living sound of a fire burning in a hearth, the sparks dancing upward into the darkness like tiny embers of hope itself. The wind outside is cold and carries the salt of the sea. It moves through narrow valleys carved by glaciers 10,000 years ago, valleys so deep and so narrow that the sun barely reaches the bottom in winter. You are listening to a world that most of us have forgotten, a world that shaped the very course of human civilization, and yet it has faded into legend, into the margins of history, almost as if it never truly existed at all. This is the world of the Vikings, and tonight we begin a journey into their story. A story of discovery and loss, of ambition and mystery, of a people who sailed to the ends of the earth and then, somehow, vanished from the memory of the world that feared them most. Before we venture deeper into this tale, know that you are safe here, that this story will unfold slowly and gently, like smoke drifting upward from that fire we heard. There is no rush. There is only the passage of time and the turning of the world. Settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift with us across centuries and oceans. This is the Calm Archive, and we are here to tell you stories that resonate in the quiet corners of your mind, stories that linger long after the world has gone to sleep. But before we can understand the Vikings themselves, we must first understand a single word that has been so thoroughly misunderstood that it has taken on an almost mythological quality all its own. The word is Viking, and it does not mean what you think it means. It was never a race, nor an ethnicity, nor a culture, though we often use it that way now, lumping together all the peoples of the far north under a single umbrella term. The word Viking is actually a verb. To go Viking meant to go raiding, to embark on an expedition of plunder and exploration. A man who went Viking was a Viking. A man who stayed home and tended his fields was not. A woman who managed her household, raised her children, and tended to the endless work of survival was not a Viking, though her world was shaped by those who were. This is crucial to understand, for it means that when we speak of the Vikings, we are not really speaking of an entire people. We are speaking of a particular activity, a particular way of going out into the world that consumed perhaps a generation, or a few generations, of the peoples who lived in Scandinavia during a narrow window of history that lasted, for practical purposes, just a few hundred years, from around the year 793 to somewhere around 1066, when the Viking Age was finally, definitively, brought to an end by history itself. The world that produced the Vikings was Scandinavia, the frozen and dramatic landscape that we now call Norway, Sweden and Denmark. Imagine, if you can, a land that has been shaped by violence, not the violence of human hands, but the violence of ice. 10,000 years ago, when the last great ice age held the earth in its grip, glaciers miles thick carved the land as if with giants' hands, scraping away the soft stone and leaving behind deep valleys and dramatic fjords where the land meets the sea. These fjords cut inland like the fingers of a hand thrust into the earth itself, and they are so deep, so narrow, so magnificently sculpted by that ancient ice that they seem almost unreal, as if they belong to another world altogether. Waterfalls plunge from cliff faces that rise thousands of feet high, and the water at the bottom of the fjords is so cold, so dark, that it seems to hold ancient secrets. The mountains rise sharply behind them, their peaks sometimes shrouded in mist and cloud for weeks at a time. In the far north, the sun itself behaves strangely. In summer, it refuses to set, circling the sky in an endless day that lasts from May until August, turning the landscape golden and strange and somehow uncertain. The light at midnight is neither day nor night, but something between, something dreamlike, and in this perpetual brightness, a person's sense of time becomes unmoored from the usual rhythms of sleep and waking. In winter, the sun vanishes almost entirely, and the land is plunged into a darkness so complete that it seems as though the sun will never return. The stars shine with an intensity that takes the breath away. The northern lights dance across the sky in sheets of green and purple and blue, moving with a life all their own. The midnight sun and the polar night, these were the rhythms that shaped the lives of the people who lived there, the alternation between exhausting light and overwhelming darkness, between the world revealing itself in all its glory and the world withdrawing into mystery. The winters are long and bitter, lasting often from September through May. Snow falls in abundance, piling up in drifts that can reach the roofs of houses. The ice forms thick on the fjords, and when the ice is strong enough, it becomes a pathway, a strange white road where once there was only water. The rivers freeze solid. The wind cuts through even heavy woolen garments as if they were gossamer, but to the people who lived there, the winter was not merely an ordeal. It was a season of settlement, of work by firelight, of craftsmanship and storytelling, of the patient creation of things that would be used when summer came again. The summers are brief and intense, compressed into a few short months when everything must be done at once. Planting, harvesting, hunting, fishing, mending, building, preparing for the long, dark months to come. There is an urgency to summer in the north, a sense that one must accomplish in those few months what others might accomplish in half a year. The growing season is short, almost desperately short, and the soil is not always generous. Much of the land is rocky, unforgiving, offering its bounty only to those willing to fight for it. Flat farmland exists in Denmark and parts of Sweden, but Norway, in particular, is a country of steep valleys and dramatic geography that does not invite easy agriculture. A farmer in Norway might own land that is barely level, might spend as much time moving rocks from his field as he does planting crops. The forests are dense and dark and full of game, elk and reindeer and boar, creatures that provided food and hides and materials for tools. The seas are cold and treacherous, but they are also rich with fish, rich with seals and whales and other bounty from the deep, rich with the resources that could sustain life when the land proved stingy. It was in this landscape, harsh, demanding, beautiful, and utterly unforgiving, that a distinctive society developed, a way of life that would eventually transform the entire medieval world. A people who learned to thrive in this environment learned lessons that would serve them well elsewhere. For most people, the reality of life in Viking Scandinavia was not raiding and adventuring at all. It was, as it always has been for most of humanity, the quiet, exhausting work of survival. The Norse people were, first and foremost, farmers and fishermen and traders. They were people who understood the value of a good harvest, who knew the weight of a tool well made, who could read the weather in the sky and the behaviour of animals in the forest. They understood the patience required to raise livestock, the timing necessary for planting, the techniques that would preserve food through the long winters. They built their farms in the fjords and the valleys, where the land was most forgiving, and they raised cattle and sheep and goats and pigs. Each animal was valuable, carefully tended, providing food, clothing, tools and materials. They grew grain when they could, though the growing season was maddeningly brief. Barley, whatever could ripen in the short northern summer. They fished in the fjords and the rivers and in the open ocean, learning the currents and seasons. They hunted seals and whales, dangerous work that required courage and skill. They traded in furs and amber and goods that came to them through mysterious networks of commerce that stretched far beyond their own lands, trading networks that would eventually connect them to the far reaches of Europe and even to the exotic East. The raids, the Viking expeditions that have so captured our imagination, were conducted by a portion of society, often younger men seeking glory and wealth, often driven by circumstance and opportunity, and, as we shall come to understand, by particular historical pressures that created a moment when such expeditions became not just possible, but almost inevitable, when the conditions aligned perfectly to launch a generation of ambitious men outward toward whatever lay beyond the horizon. The society that produced the Vikings was stratified into distinct classes, a hierarchy that was as rigid as it was necessary in a world that depended on cooperation and order for simple survival. At the top were the jarls, the nobles, the chieftains who commanded respect and authority, who owned the best land and the most resources, whose halls were centres of power and culture and gathering. These were men of wealth and power, though their power was not absolute. It rested on their ability to attract followers, to reward loyalty, to provide protection and opportunity, to demonstrate martial prowess and wisdom in equal measure. A jarl was expected to be generous with his followers, to share the spoils of raids and trade, to maintain a retinue of warriors who would be bound to him by loyalty and obligation. Below them were the carls, the freemen, the farmers and merchants and craftspeople who made up the bulk of the population. These were people who owned land of their own, who were responsible for their own families and their own survival, who owed respect to the Jarls but were not enslaved to them. They could speak their minds in the assemblies where law was made. They could accumulate wealth and status. A carl might become wealthy through trade or farming, might gain enough respect and enough followers to aspire to become a jarl themselves, or might see his son rise to that status. The social structure was not entirely static. There was movement, possibility, opportunity for those with ambition and luck. And at the bottom of the social hierarchy were the thralls, the slaves, who were often captured in raids or born into slavery, who were owned as property like cattle, and whose labour was the backbone of the wealthy household. They worked the fields, maintained the farms, performed the endless tasks that freed the jarls and carls to pursue other activities. This was not a gentle society, and slavery was not a gentle institution, but it was a society that understood itself, that had mechanisms for advancement and change, that was not entirely bound by the accident of birth. A determined man or woman might rise. The world offered opportunity to those willing to seize it. And here we must speak of something that may surprise you, a detail of Viking society that sets it apart from so much of the medieval world that surrounded it: the position of women. In most of medieval Europe, women were property, first of their fathers, then of their husbands, without rights of their own, vulnerable and subordinate. In Viking society, women enjoyed a freedom and a legal standing that was genuinely remarkable for the time. A woman could own property, a woman could inherit land and wealth, a woman could request a divorce from her husband, and the law would recognize her right to do so. A woman could testify in legal matters, a woman could manage a household and conduct its business, and in doing so she wielded genuine authority and respect. When a man went Viking, when he departed on a raid or an expedition of trade, it was often his wife or his daughter or his mother who managed his lands, who made decisions about planting and harvesting and the management of slaves and resources. This was not out of kindness or enlightenment on the part of men, but rather out of necessity. In a society where so many men were gone for portions of the year, on ventures across the sea, the women who remained had to have the authority and the legal standing to make decisions. They had to be able to function, independently if necessary, in the management of complex economic enterprises. The legacy of this would echo through history. One might even argue that the relative freedom of women in Viking society left traces that persisted long after the Viking Age itself had ended, traces that would eventually contribute to the societies and the legal systems that would emerge in Scandinavia and Northern Europe in the centuries to come. But none of this, none of the social organisation, none of the legal standing of women, none of the careful hierarchies and the slow, patient work of agriculture and trade would have been possible without a single technological innovation, a type of ship that was so revolutionary, so perfectly adapted to both the open ocean and the shallow rivers of Europe, that it became the instrument through which the entire Viking Age was conducted. We must speak now of the longship, the dragon ship, the vessel that haunted the nightmares of Christendom for centuries. The longship was a marvel of engineering, a boat so efficient, so elegant, so perfectly designed for its purpose that its form barely changed for several hundred years. To understand the longship, you must forget almost everything you think you know about medieval ships. The great round-bellied merchant vessels and the high castle warships that would later dominate the oceans of the world had not yet been built. The Mediterranean had its galleys, sleek and low and designed to be rowed in calm waters, but the Atlantic and the North Sea were different, more violent, more treacherous, and they demanded a different approach. The longship was the answer to that demand, a vessel that seemed to contradict itself. It was both a war machine and a merchant vessel, both a deep ocean explorer and a shallow draft riverboat. It could sail where no ship had sailed before, and it could go where no ship should have been able to go, up rivers so narrow and shallow that even small boats seemed impossible. To build a longship was to understand wood and water in a way that most people today cannot fully grasp. It required not just skill, but intuition, an almost instinctive knowledge of how wood moves and bends and ages, of how a tree's grain can be read like a book, of how the hull of a ship must move with the sea rather than against it. The construction method was called clinker building, or clinker laid, and it is still used today, though it is now rare and precious and known only by master craftspeople who have studied the old ways. In clinker construction, the planks of the hull overlap each other, like roof shingles, each plank riveted to the next with iron rivets that were hammered from the inside and the outside until they held fast. The riveting was meticulous work, exhausting and demanding, but it had to be done correctly or the ship would fail. This creates a hull that is remarkably flexible, that can bend and flex with the waves instead of fighting them, that distributes the stress of the water across the entire structure rather than concentrating it at particular points. When a clinker-built hull meets a heavy sea, it seems almost alive, absorbing the energy of the waves, adapting to the changing shape of the water, moving with the ocean rather than colliding with it. The result is a boat that can ride through heavy seas that would shatter a rigid hull, a boat that can be drawn up onto the beach to be repaired or to rest, a boat whose flexibility is part of its genius. A rigid ship might be stronger in theory, but a flexible ship is stronger in practice, stronger in the unpredictable reality of the sea. The draft, the depth of water that the ship requires to float, was shallow, sometimes as little as 3 feet when the ship was fully loaded. This meant that a longship could navigate rivers that most other ships could not, could sail up the Thames in England, could navigate the Seine in France, could go inland where merchant ships and war galleys could never hope to follow. The keel was not deep and heavy as in later ocean-going ships, and this was by design. Instead, the longship relied on its shallow width and its light construction to move through the water with remarkable speed. A longship could be rowed. It typically carried between 20 and 30 oars on each side, depending on its size, and 50 rowers working in concert could move a ship that might be 70 feet long through the water at speeds that were impressive for the time. But the longship was also a sail ship. A single square sail, woven from wool and treated with animal fat to make it water-resistant, could catch the Atlantic wind and drive the vessel across open ocean at speeds that would carry it from Scandinavia to England or to Ireland in just a few days of sailing, depending on the wind and the weather. What made the longship revolutionary was not any single feature, but rather the combination of all these features into a unified whole. The shallow draft meant it could be beached on any shore, could be pulled up onto the rocks and the sand without damage, could be repaired or hidden or simply left while the crew ventured inland on foot. The flexibility of the clinker-built hull meant it could survive the treacherous waters of the North Sea, the Atlantic, the storms and the swells that would have destroyed a more rigid vessel. The combination of oars and sail gave it flexibility and speed, the ability to make progress whether the wind favoured it or not. And its design, its sleek and tapered form, gave it a beauty that spoke of its purpose. This was a predator, a vessel designed to move swiftly through water and to deliver warriors to places where they were not wanted. For defence, for offence, the longship was supreme. It could approach silently under oars when the wind failed. It could deliver men to a shore before defenders could organise. And then, when the raid was complete, when the treasure had been gathered, or the trading had been done, it could be turned around and withdrawn, pulled back into the sea, carried away before a serious military response could be mounted. The longship was not invented by the Vikings. The Norse peoples did not emerge from a frozen void with a suddenly perfect understanding of shipbuilding. Rather, they inherited techniques from other seafaring peoples, and they refined them, adapted them, perfected them for their own particular purposes. But once they had this tool in hand, once they had a vessel that could do what no other ship could do, the world became open to them in a way that it was open to no other people at that particular moment in history. The Mediterranean powers had their galleys, their well-established trade routes, their connection to the Roman past and the Byzantine present. The Atlantic coast was largely unknown, largely undefended, largely ripe for the taking by anyone with the speed and the courage to seize it. But before the ships, before the raids, before the transformation of the medieval world, we must speak of the mythology that gave meaning to the world in which the Norse peoples lived. For the Vikings were not simply raiders and traders and farmers, animated by greed or by hunger or by blind ambition. They lived in a cosmos, a universe ordered by myth and belief, inhabited by gods and giants and creatures of various kinds, structured by a logic that was entirely their own. To understand the Vikings, we must understand the world as they understood it, the 9 worlds as they conceived of them, arranged around the great world tree Yggdrasil, which grew at the centre of everything, its roots extending downward into the depths, its branches reaching upward into the sky, its form connecting all things to all other things. At the top, in the branches of the world tree, was Asgard, the home of the Aesir gods, the principal deities of the Norse pantheon. It was a realm of extraordinary beauty, of halls with roofs of gold, of gardens where the gods dwelt in peace and majesty. Here dwelt Odin, the All-Father, one-eyed and wise, the god of poetry and magic and war and death. According to the myths, Odin had sacrificed his eye for wisdom, had hung himself from the world tree for 9 nights to learn the secrets of the runes, had wandered the earth in disguise seeking knowledge. Here too dwelt Thor, the thunder god, strong and bold and quick to anger, the protector of mankind and the defender of Asgard against the giants and the forces of chaos. Thor rode through the sky in a chariot pulled by 2 great goats, and when he swung his hammer Mjolnir, it created the thunder and lightning that split the sky. Here was Freya, the goddess of love and fertility and war and magic, a figure of extraordinary power and autonomy, who chose which warriors would fall in battle and be taken to Valhalla. These gods were not distant and perfect, not the austere deities of the Christian Church that would later attempt to supplant them. They were passionate and flawed. They quarrelled with each other over matters of pride and honour. They made mistakes. They experienced jealousy and anger and love. They were in many ways very human, though immortal and far more powerful than any human could hope to be. They were gods that a warrior could understand, that a farmer could relate to, that a merchant could respect. At the centre of Asgard stood Yggdrasil, and by its trunk sat Odin on his throne, from which he could see all the 9 worlds, watching the events that unfolded in Midgard and beyond. In the middle of the world tree, in the realm of humankind, was Midgard, the world of men, the place where humans lived and worked and struggled and died. This was the earth, the middle world, not as holy as Asgard and not as terrible as the darker realms below. Around Midgard wound Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, enormous beings of chaos and danger who were opposed to the gods and the natural order. There was Muspelheim, the realm of fire, burning and destructive. There was Niflheim, the realm of ice and cold and mist. There was Hel, the realm of the dead, ruled over by a goddess of the same name, a figure neither completely evil nor completely good, but rather the necessary guardian of death and what lay beyond it. The 9 worlds existed in relationship to one another, interconnected, balanced, held together by the world tree itself, by the relationships between the gods, by a careful and precarious order. And yet, for all its order, for all its structure, the Norse cosmos was not eternal. It was not meant to last forever. According to Norse mythology, a great catastrophe would eventually occur, an ending that would come not as divine punishment, but as the inevitable working out of fate itself. This was Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, the end of the world, a cosmic event in which the boundaries between the realms would break down, in which chaos would overtake order, in which the gods themselves would fall in battle against the forces of destruction. The great serpent Jormungandr, so vast that it encircled the entire world with its body, would rise from the ocean. The great wolf Fenrir would break free from his chains and devour the sun itself. The stars would vanish from the sky. The earth would sink into the sea. And yet, and this is crucial, after the darkness, after the destruction, the earth would rise again from the waters. New lands would emerge. The sun would have a daughter who would carry on its light. A new god, Modi, would inherit the hall of the gods. Life would return. Out of destruction would come renewal. Out of ending would come a new beginning. The cosmos would not be destroyed permanently. It would be transformed. This mythology shaped the way the Norse peoples understood their own lives and their own deaths. A warrior who died in battle would be taken by the Valkyries, the female warriors who served Odin, and carried to Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where he would feast and fight and make merry for eternity, preparing himself for the final battle of Ragnarök when all warriors would be called to fight alongside the gods against the forces of chaos. Dying in one's bed, of sickness or old age, meant going to Hel, the realm of the dead, which was not so much a place of punishment as a place of diminishment, a continuation of existence but a dimmer, weaker existence than what was lived in the bright world above. To die in battle was to achieve something approaching immortality. To die fighting the forces of chaos, even if you died as the world itself was ending, was to achieve glory that would echo through eternity. This was not a theology that discouraged violence or raiding or the risks of maritime adventure. It was a theology that encouraged them. that surrounded them with meaning and significance, that transformed a raid or a voyage into not merely a commercial venture or a theft, but a kind of participation in the cosmic struggle between order and chaos, between the gods and the giants, between civilization and the wild. Fate itself, called wyrd in the Norse language, was another crucial concept, another pillar of the worldview that animated Viking society. Wyrd meant that every person's destiny was already determined, that the threads of your fate were already woven by the Norns, three goddess-like beings who sat beneath the world tree and controlled the destinies of all beings, gods and humans alike. This might seem like a philosophy of helplessness, of passivity, of accepting whatever comes without resistance. But the Norse understood it differently. Yes, your death was already written. Yes, when you would die and how you would die was already determined, but this knowledge did not free you from the obligation to act, to struggle, to face your wyrd with courage and honour. Indeed, it demanded that you do so. Because what was determined was the fact of your death, not the manner of it, not the glory of it, not the stories that would be told about it. If you were destined to die at sea, you did not avoid the sea. Instead, you sailed as bravely and as skillfully as you could. You died on your own terms, if possible. You faced your wyrd with dignity. And if by some miracle you survived, well then, your wyrd in that moment was that you would survive, and you would live to see another day. This was a philosophy, a way of understanding the world and one's place in it, that was perfectly suited to the life that the Norse peoples lived. It encouraged daring and bravery. It made sense of a world in which danger was constant and death could come without warning. It gave meaning to suffering, to loss, to the terrible price of survival in a harsh land and on treacherous seas. It was also a philosophy that, once the longship had been perfected, once the means of raiding had been developed, pointed in a particular direction, outward. If you were destined to achieve glory, why not achieve it abroad? If you were destined to become wealthy, why not seek that wealth in Christian lands that were richer than your own? If you were destined to survive a voyage, you might as well make that voyage to England or France or even farther afield. All of these elements, the harsh geography, the social structure, the technological innovation of the longship, the mythology and the philosophy that gave meaning to violence and adventure, came together at a particular moment in history, a moment when several other factors aligned to create a perfect storm. The population of Scandinavia was growing. There were more people than there were good farmlands to support them. The practice of primogeniture was becoming more common, the custom by which only the eldest son would inherit the family lands, leaving younger sons without resources and without a clear path to wealth and status. The climate itself was beginning to shift, warming slightly after a period of cooler weather, making voyages across the Atlantic more feasible, making it possible to navigate waters that had been impassable just decades before. And across the waters, in the kingdoms of Christian Europe, there were monasteries full of treasures, communities of monks and priests wholly unprepared for violence, towns and cities defended by men on foot, and mounted knights who were spread too thin across too much territory to respond quickly when a ship appeared on the horizon and warriors began to pour ashore. In the year 793, on a date now believed to be June 8th, a fleet of ships appeared off the coast of northeastern England. The day was likely fair, clear enough to see the land from far out at sea, clear enough that the monks who kept watch might have had some warning. But warning changed nothing. The ships were clinker-built, propelled by sail and oar, and they carried warriors who descended on the monastery of Lindisfarne with a violence that the monks had never imagined, never prepared for, never thought possible. Lindisfarne was an island monastery off the coast of Northumbria, a centre of learning and piety, a place where monks copied manuscripts by candlelight and conducted religious services in their stone chapel and maintained the light of Christian learning during the early medieval period. The monastery was not defended. There were no soldiers there, no walls high enough to stop a determined enemy, no means of resistance except prayer. When the Vikings came ashore, the monks attempted to defend their most precious possessions, the religious relics, the illuminated manuscripts with their pages of gold and blue and crimson, the treasures they had preserved and worked over for generations. But they were no match for armed warriors trained in violence and conquest. Some of the monks were killed, some were enslaved and taken aboard the ships, their futures forever altered. The monastery was plundered with methodical efficiency and burned, the flames consuming centuries of accumulated knowledge and labour. And when the news of this attack spread across Christian Europe, Carried by survivors and messengers from monastery to monastery, it sent a shockwave through the established order, a moment of profound disruption that would echo for centuries. The idea that such a thing was possible, that warriors would strike at a place of prayer and learning and escape unpunished, seemed to overturn the natural order of the world. In England and France and across Christian Europe, the raid on Lindisfarne was recognised as something new, something terrible, something that broke the rules of warfare as they had come to be understood. A prayer began to circulate through monasteries and churches, a prayer that expressed the horror and the fear that the attack had inspired. "From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord." This prayer captured something essential about the shock that the Vikings represented. They were not Christian. They did not fight according to the rules of Christian warfare. They did not respect the sanctity of religious places. They came out of nowhere, struck quickly, and vanished before a serious military response could be organised. They were, in short, a kind of warfare, a kind of violence, that Christian Europe had no experience defending against. But Lindisfarne was only the beginning. What had begun was not a few isolated raids by desperate Northmen, but rather the opening of a historical epoch that would reshape the entire medieval world. The Vikings would not remain content with raiding monasteries, though they would continue to do so. They would not limit themselves to the coasts of England and France, though those would remain their primary targets. Instead, over the next 2 centuries and more, they would spread out across the known world in all directions. They would establish themselves in Ireland and eventually in England. They would colonise Iceland, a volcanic island in the middle of the Atlantic that had been discovered by Irish monks, but that the Norse would transform into a thriving community. They would reach Greenland, and from Greenland they would reach North America, the land they called Vinland, discovering a continent that would not be widely known to Christian Europe for another 500 years. To the east, they would follow the rivers of Russia into the continent, establishing trade routes that would eventually reach Baghdad and the Far East. To the south, they would venture into the Mediterranean, raiding and trading as they went, reaching Sicily and beyond. They would become traders on an enormous scale, controlling the commerce of northern Europe, establishing towns and settlements that would grow into the great cities of later centuries. They would become conquerors, establishing kingdoms in England and in France and in Normandy, where the descendants of Norse raiders would eventually become the Norman nobles who would, in 1066, conquer England and transform British history. All of this lay in the future, in the centuries yet to unfold, but in the moment of the raid on Lindisfarne, in that instant when the first monks saw the strange ships appear on the horizon, in that terrible hour when fire consumed the monastery and violence descended on a place that had known only prayer and learning, the Viking Age began. The world would never be quite the same again. The medieval order had been shaken. The assumptions about power and geography and the possibility of conquest had been fundamentally altered, and the age that was beginning would produce some of the most remarkable figures in human history, explorers and traders and conquerors who would reshape the medieval world and leave marks on history that would persist long after their own time had faded into legend. But before we follow them on those voyages, before we trace their paths across oceans and rivers and continents, before we discover what they found and how they changed the world, and how the world, in turn, eventually forgot them, we must pause here at the threshold. We must breathe with the darkness that is coming, the calm that precedes the storm, the moment of gathering before the great ventures begin. And in that moment, we invite you to rest with us, to let your consciousness drift, to prepare yourself for the tales that will unfold as this story continues into its second movement, where the Vikings will venture out from their northern homes and begin to reshape the medieval world in ways that none could have predicted, touching continents they did not know existed, and building empires that would eventually crumble and be forgotten. Their greatest achievement, the discovery of a new world, lost to history for 500 years, waiting to be rediscovered by a later age that thought itself so much more advanced, so much more capable, so much more worthy of the title explorer than the fierce and fearless men who had come before. Section 3. The Great Danelaw. England divided. In the year that historians mark as 865 of the Christian era, a shadow fell across the green valleys of England. Not a shadow of clouds gathering, but something more deliberate, more terrible in its purpose. A great heathen army, as the Anglo-Saxon monks would later write with trembling hands, landed on the eastern shores of the kingdom. And this was not a raid like the ones that had come before. swift, violent, and gone as suddenly as the autumn wind. This army came to stay, this army came to conquer. The commanders of this vast force were said to be the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, that legendary figure who occupied such a prominent place in Norse saga and legend. Whether Ragnar was a real king or a composite of many warriors woven together by tradition matters less than the impact of his sons. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, these names echoed through the monasteries and manors of England like the tolling of a bell that would not stop ringing. The monks who recorded their deeds seemed almost paralysed by the sheer audacity of it all, the systematic way these Vikings methodically conquered kingdom after kingdom, as if they were following some divine blueprint written in the runes and stars of their own gods. The invasion was not random chaos, though it appeared so to those who watched their homes burn. There was strategy here, intelligence born from years of raiding, of understanding how kingdoms worked and how they could be broken. The Vikings divided their forces, struck at multiple points simultaneously, and when kingdoms sent armies to meet them, those armies fell. The pattern repeated itself with almost numbing regularity. Advance, conquer, establish a base, strike again. By 867, York had fallen. By 869, East Anglia lay under Viking control. The great King Edmund of East Anglia, that figure of Christian martyrdom who would later inspire so much devotion, was slain, shot full of arrows, according to legend, for refusing to turn from his god. The heathen army pressed on with relentless purpose. What emerged from this conquest was something unprecedented in the history of the British Isles, a formal division of land between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Viking invaders. The map of England was redrawn, territory by territory, until nearly half the kingdom stood under Viking rule or heavily influenced by Viking power. The boundary line ran northeast to southwest, from the Thames River up through the Midlands to the River Humber. Everything to the north and east of this line became known as the Danelaw, literally the law of the Danes, though the Vikings who settled there called themselves Norsemen. This was not conquered territory in the traditional sense. This was partition, division, a coexistence negotiated in blood and sealed by necessity. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that remained, Wessex, Mercia, and the smaller kingdoms clinging to survival, retained their independence but had lost half their realm. The Danelaw became a kingdom of transformation. Where Anglo-Saxon culture and Viking culture met, they did not simply destroy one another. Instead, they began to merge, to blend like watercolours bleeding into one another on parchment. The language evolved, the laws adapted, new customs arose from old ones. The Viking settlers were not nomads who sought only plunder and movement. Many of them came with their families, with their livestock, with the intention of building permanent homes. They married Anglo-Saxon women. They adopted Christianity, many of them, though they clung to their own traditions as well. Over time, these Vikings would become English, and England would be forever changed by their presence. But not all of England was content with this division. In the southern kingdom of Wessex, in the years after the initial invasion, there arose a king whose determination would challenge the permanence of the Danelaw. His name was Alfred, and he would become known to history as Alfred the Great, though that grandeur came to him only after a long and desperate struggle that nearly cost him everything. Alfred came to the throne of Wessex in 871, at a moment when his kingdom hung on the precipice of obliteration. The Viking pressure was constant, relentless, and the previous kings of Wessex had managed only to delay the inevitable. But Alfred possessed something that could not be taught by history books or battle experience alone. He possessed will. He possessed an almost obsessive need to preserve something precious, not merely the political independence of his kingdom, but the preservation of learning itself, the written word, the accumulated wisdom of Christian civilization, in a time when such things seemed almost impossibly fragile. The early years of Alfred's reign were marked by desperate conflict. The Vikings attacked repeatedly, and repeatedly Alfred's armies met them in battle. In 878, after one particularly crushing defeat, Alfred was forced to retreat into the Somerset marshes, losing everything: his kingdom, his army, his apparent future. In that moment of deepest despair, when it seemed that the Danelaw would consume all of England, Alfred rallied his remaining forces. The legend speaks of him in hiding, disguised as a common man, learning the secrets of his enemies, preparing for his moment of resurrection. That moment came at the Battle of Edington in May of 878, Against all odds, against a Viking army that had seemed unbeatable, Alfred's forces prevailed. The victory was not total annihilation. Alfred was wise enough to know that the Vikings could not be completely destroyed, that they were too numerous, too skilled, too entrenched in the English lands. Instead, he negotiated a peace. The Treaty of Wedmore, signed that same year, formalised what was already obvious on the ground. The Danelaw would remain Viking territory, but Wessex would remain independent. The boundary was drawn again, confirmed, this time not in battle but in the careful words of diplomacy. But Alfred understood something crucial that many warriors of his age did not. A kingdom is preserved not only by soldiers but by learning, by law, by the transmission of knowledge to future generations. In the years after Edington, with his borders finally secured, Alfred embarked on an ambitious programme of cultural and intellectual restoration. He imported scholars from across Europe, established schools, worked personally on the translation of Latin text into Anglo-Saxon English, so that his people could read and understand the wisdom of the ancients. He revised the laws of his kingdom, creating a legal code that blended Anglo-Saxon tradition with the best of the Christian legal heritage. He built fortifications, a network of strongholds called burhs, positioned strategically across his kingdom to prevent any future invasion from progressing too far inland. These burhs were more than mere military installations. They were centres of administration and refuge, places where the local population could flee in times of danger, where regional governance could be maintained even if outlying areas fell under attack. Alfred's genius was in understanding that a kingdom defended by fortifications alone, without education and culture and law, would eventually crumble. He saw himself not merely as a military commander, but as the guardian of English Christian civilization itself, the preserver of a way of life that seemed perpetually under threat from the pagan north. The legacy of Alfred is the legacy of resistance through strength and intellect combined. When his life ended in 899, he left behind a kingdom that had survived the Viking onslaught and remained independent, a kingdom whose culture had been preserved and strengthened, not weakened by the struggle. His descendants would continue his work, gradually expanding Wessex's control, slowly reconquering the Danelaw territory piece by piece. But the Vikings were not erased from England. They remained, woven into the fabric of the land, their influence persistent, their presence becoming more English with each passing generation. And while Alfred was establishing himself as the great defender of Anglo-Saxon England, securing the western side of the Viking world from further conquest, something equally remarkable was unfolding in the territory that the Vikings did control. In the city of York, in the heart of the Danelaw, a Viking settlement was flourishing that would become legendary even in its own time. The Anglo-Saxons had called it York. The Vikings called it Jorvik, pronouncing it with the music of their northern tongue. This was more than simply a military stronghold where conquerors ruled over a subjugated population. This was becoming a true city, a place of markets and merchants, of craftspeople and commerce, of wealth and exchange. The Vikings who had conquered York were settling there, establishing shops, building homes, integrating into the urban fabric. By the early 10th century, Jorvik had become one of the great trading cities of northern Europe, its wharves busy with ships, its streets echoing with the languages of a dozen nations. Archaeologists in later centuries would uncover the remains of Viking York buried beneath the medieval city, and what they found would astonish them. Evidence of widespread manufacturing, streets laid out in careful patterns, houses with sophisticated water systems, pottery workshops producing beautiful vessels, bone workers crafting intricate items, blacksmiths forging weapons and tools. The Viking settlement in York was not a military camp maintained through conquest and fear. It was a genuine city, self-sustaining and self-replicating, growing and changing with each year that passed. The Viking settlers did not see themselves as occupiers of a hostile land. They saw themselves as founders of a new home, builders of a new civilization. The trading networks that connected Jorvik to the wider world were complex and far-reaching, extending in multiple directions simultaneously. Merchants from this Viking city could obtain goods from across Europe and beyond. Wine from the Mediterranean, cloth from Flanders, amber from the Baltic coast, furs from the frozen forests of the north, silver from mines in the mountains of Bohemia. Goods arrived by ship and by land-based trade routes, conveyed by merchants of many different ethnicities and backgrounds. In turn, they exported their own goods, English woolens prized across the continent for their quality and warmth, metalwork of exceptional quality fashioned by Viking craftspeople, jewellery, and decorated items that combined Norse artistic sensibility with Christian symbolism and that commodity that had made the Viking raids so destructive in the first place. Enslaved human beings, captured in raids and warfare, sold to merchants and transported to foreign markets where they would be forced to labour for their new masters. This last trade was not secondary or incidental to Viking commerce. Slavery was central to their economy, and estimates suggest that slave trading was possibly the most profitable commodity flowing through Viking networks in certain periods and locations. The human cost of this commerce was immense and tragic, even if the Viking traders themselves seemed largely unmoved by moral considerations. This is the other side of the Viking story, the side that must be acknowledged and understood. The Vikings who settled in Jorvik and throughout the Danelaw were not simply adventurers and explorers. They were also warriors and raiders, and the system of slavery that they participated in was vast and brutal. The great slave markets of the Islamic world were supplied in part by Vikings, who conducted raids and warfare across Europe and sold the captives they took. This shadow side of the Viking expansion is as much a part of their history as their exploration and their settlements. They brought innovation and commerce, art and organisation, but they also brought violence, enslavement and suffering on a scale that is sometimes obscured by the romance of their voyages. Yet even as the Vikings were establishing themselves in England and creating the Danelaw, other Vikings were moving in entirely different directions. While the sons of Ragnar and their followers were conquering English kingdoms, other Norse seafarers were looking eastward, toward rivers that flowed through forests and steppes, toward lands that had never seen Viking ships. These men, driven by the same hunger for trade and conquest but operating in a completely different environment, would leave a mark on the world that would prove even more profound than the conquest of England. Section 4. The Eastern Path, Varangians, Rus, and the Road to Byzantium. The story of the Vikings expands eastward like ripples spreading across still water, and the pattern of expansion that unfolded in the east was fundamentally different from what occurred in the west. While Vikings were raiding and settling England, other Norse entrepreneurs, for that is what they truly were, adventurers and merchants combined, were pioneering trade routes that penetrated deeper into the European continent than any Viking ships had previously travelled. They were following rivers, not sailing open oceans, penetrating inland through the waterways of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and the lands beyond. These Eastern Vikings became known in history as the Varangians, from the Old Norse word varanga, which may mean pledge, or oath-taker, or perhaps it simply meant warrior. The Varangians were predominantly Swedish Vikings, though they would encounter and recruit warriors and merchants from many other lands. Where the Danish and Norwegian Vikings had focused on coastal raids and Atlantic exploration, the Swedish Vikings understood that the greatest wealth might lie inland, following the ancient trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and ultimately to the fabulously rich Islamic Caliphate and the distant lands of the East. The rivers were the highways of this inland world, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don. These mighty waterways flowed from north to south, from the cold Baltic lands toward warmer climates and richer markets. The Varangians, showing the same ingenuity and determination they demonstrated elsewhere, quickly understood how to navigate these rivers, how to portage their boats around waterfalls and rapids, how to establish trading posts and fortified settlements at key junctions where the water routes intersected or where portages between different rivers were necessary. They were not interested in conquest in the way that their Danish cousins had been in England. They were interested in trade, in establishing a commercial network that would bring wealth flowing back to their homelands. The Varangians established trading outposts that gradually grew into permanent settlements. The most important of these was at a location where the Dnieper River could be easily portaged to the Volga, a place that would eventually become the city of Novgorod in Russian history. But the most famous and most significant Varangian settlement was founded further south, on a high bluff overlooking the Dnieper. This settlement would eventually become Kiev, or Kyiv as it is known today, the great city that would become the capital of a new state that emerged from Varangian colonization. And here is where the story takes a turn that would reshape the history of Eastern Europe and Russia itself. The Varangians who settled these lands did not remain separate from the indigenous Slavic populations that they encountered, and this is crucial to understanding what transpired. They intermarried with them, They adopted many of their customs, and slowly, over generations, something new emerged. A hybrid culture that was neither purely Norse nor purely Slavic, but a blending of both. The Norse merchants and warriors who had come seeking trade and wealth gradually became settlers and rulers. They adopted Slavic names, married Slavic women, and established themselves as the aristocratic class of a new society. This process of cultural assimilation was not unique to the Varangians. It had happened to the Norse wherever they settled in significant numbers. But in the case of the Varangians in Eastern Europe, the transformation was particularly profound because they were establishing themselves not as conquering overlords, but as participants in an ongoing process of state-building and civilization development. The Slavic peoples they encountered had their own developed cultures, their own agricultural traditions, their own organized settlements. The Varangians did not destroy this existing civilization. Instead, they integrated themselves into it, took control of the most lucrative aspects of the trade, and gradually became Slavicized even as they brought Norse cultural elements into the mix. This process of cultural transformation was dramatic in one particular aspect. The Varangians came to be known, in the histories and chronicles of the region, as the Rus, or the Varangian Rus, and this name, carried forward by generations of historians and chroniclers, gave birth to a new word, a new identity. The lands where the Varangians had established their dominion became known as the Rus lands, and eventually, centuries later, these lands would become Russia. One of the great ironies of history is that the nation that would come to be called Russia, that vast empire that would stretch across 11 time zones and profoundly shape the history of the world, was named after the Viking traders and warriors who had penetrated its rivers and established the first dynastic rule over its scattered peoples. The greatest of the early Varangian rulers was a man named Oleg, who established himself at Kiev and began to extend his power down the Dnieper River toward the Black Sea. Oleg was ambitious, and he understood that the greatest wealth and prestige lay not in merely controlling the local trade routes, but in establishing direct contact with Constantinople, the legendary city that the Norse called Miklagard, the Great City, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated cities in the entire world. Constantinople was more than merely a great trading centre, though it was certainly that. It was the heir to Rome itself, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East, ruled by an emperor who claimed direct descent from Caesar, maintaining the traditions and pageantry of Rome, even as Rome itself had fallen to barbarian kingdoms centuries before. The city was surrounded by massive walls that had never been breached, walls that had withstood siege after siege. Inside those walls, the greatest cathedral in Christendom rose in breathtaking beauty. The Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, with its massive dome that seemed to float unsupported in the air, a structure so magnificent that those who entered it for the first time were often left speechless by its grandeur. To reach Constantinople from Kiev, Oleg had to navigate the Dnieper River all the way to its mouth at the Black Sea, a journey of several hundred kilometers through lands that were not always friendly and waters that presented constant dangers. Oleg made this journey and established diplomatic and commercial relations with Constantinople itself. The Byzantine chronicles record his arrival with surprise and fascination. Vikings, these barbarians from the frozen north, were appearing at the very gates of the Roman Empire seeking to trade and to negotiate treaties. The Varangian trade routes became established as a major commercial network, perhaps the most sophisticated and far-reaching commercial system that the medieval Vikings ever created. Merchandise moved in both directions. From the north came furs and amber, walrus ivory and raw goods that the Viking settlements could obtain from their territories and from their trade with other northern peoples. The furs came from the Arctic regions, sable and marten, beaver and fox, animals that thrived in the frozen forests. The amber came from the Baltic shores, that fossilized tree resin that had been treasured as a luxury good since before the Romans. From the south came wine and spices, silk and sophisticated manufactured goods, and most importantly silver, the precious metal that the Islamic Caliphate minted in enormous quantities and that flowed northward through Constantinople and into Viking hands. This silver was not hoarded in vaults. It was melted down and fashioned into jewellery, into arm rings and neck rings that were the measure of wealth and status in Norse society. A Viking chieftain wearing a dozen silver arm rings was displaying not vanity but wealth, not personal adornment but a walking advertisement of his success in trade and conquest. The amount of silver that flowed northward through the Varangian trade routes was staggering. Archaeological evidence from Viking burial sites in Scandinavia reveals that the greatest concentration of Islamic silver coins found anywhere in the Viking world comes from the 9th and 10th centuries, exactly the period when the Varangian trade routes were being established and developed. This was wealth on a scale that the Western Vikings, raiding coastal monasteries and small towns, could only dream of. This was the wealth of empires, of vast trading networks, of direct access to the financial systems of the Islamic world. The Varangian trade networks extended far beyond what most people realize. Recent archaeology and scholarship have established that Viking merchants travelled not just to Baghdad but far beyond it, that they reached the lands of the Khazars on the Volga, that they traded with peoples across Central Asia, that goods flowed from as far away as China through intermediaries and merchant networks that touched Varangian hands. The Vikings were not isolated raiders on the periphery of civilization. In the east, they were integrated into the great trade networks of Afro-Eurasia, participating in exchange systems that had been developing for centuries. The greatest testament to the Varangian expansion is a remarkable document that has come down to us through Arab sources. In the year 921, an Arab diplomat and scholar named Ahmad ibn Fadlan was sent by the Caliph of Baghdad on a mission to the Varangian Rus on the Volga River. Ibn Fadlan was a man of learning and education, accustomed to the sophisticated culture of Baghdad, and what he witnessed among the Varangians shocked and fascinated him in equal measure. His account, preserved in Arabic manuscripts, is one of the most vivid descriptions we possess of the Vikings in their eastern realm. Ibn Fadlan described the Varangians, whom he called the Rus, with a mixture of admiration and revulsion. He noted their physical appearance, tall, with red hair and beards, with tattooed bodies that bore marks of serpents and trees extending from the neck down to the fingertips. He observed their wealth, the golden neck rings and bracelets that adorned them, the richness of their clothes, but he was also critical, noting what he considered their disgusting habits, their lack of modesty, their casual approach to sexuality that scandalized his Islamic sensibilities. Most famously, Ibn Fadlan described Varangian funeral practices, including the ritual burning of the dead with grave goods, and, according to his account, the sacrifice of a slave woman who would join her master in death. Ibn Fadlan's account, so detailed and vivid, confirms that by the 10th century, the Varangians had established themselves as a major power in Eastern Europe, with wealth and influence that rivaled the great kingdoms of Western Europe. They had created trade networks that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea, that brought them into contact with Constantinople and the Islamic world, that made them wealthy beyond the measure of most Viking communities, and gave them access to resources and information that would have seemed almost magical to their less fortunate cousins in the West. If you're finding yourself drawn into the meditative depths of Viking history, if the scale and scope of their expansion is beginning to reshape how you understand medieval Europe and the connections between civilizations, you're experiencing something that the Calm Archive specializes in, taking the grand sweep of human achievement and presenting it in a way that encourages both deep learning and profound relaxation. We invite you to continue this journey with us, to subscribe to the Calm Archive and receive regular episodes that explore the hidden stories of exploration and discovery that shaped our world. But the Varangian success in the East did not mean abandonment of the North. Norse explorers and traders continued to seek new lands, new routes, new opportunities. If some Vikings looked east toward the rivers and the Islamic world, others looked north and west, toward the open Atlantic, toward islands that few Europeans knew existed. And in the year 870 or thereabouts, Norwegian sailors caught sight of land that would change the course of Viking expansion forever. The island that they had discovered was volcanic and forbidding, with high mountains and glaciers, hot springs that erupted from the earth, and surprisingly, despite its harsh appearance, with rich grazing lands in its coastal regions. The Norse named it Island, Eland, which has been translated into English as Iceland. The discovery of Iceland was not entirely accidental. Viking sailors had observed birds flying from certain directions and had deduced that land must exist in that direction. They had followed the birds and found the island. Once found, Iceland immediately became attractive to Norse settlement. The first permanent settler of Iceland was a man named Ingolfur Arnarsson, who, according to legend, arrived around 874 CE and established a farm in the location that would eventually become Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. But Ingolfur was not fleeing an empty land or seeking an uninhabited refuge. He was fleeing something specific, the political unification of Norway under a single king, a process that had been driven by a ruthless warrior named Harald Fairhair. Harald had spent the better part of 3 decades consolidating power, crushing rival chieftains, and establishing himself as the first true king of all Norway. In the process, he had made enemies of many Norse nobles and jarls who had previously ruled their own territories with relative independence. When Harald Fairhair succeeded in unifying Norway, many of those displaced Norwegian chieftains and their followers faced a choice: submit to the new centralized authority or leave. Iceland became the destination for those who chose to leave. Wave after wave of Norse settlers arrived on the island, bringing their families, their livestock, their slaves, and their traditions. They were not fleeing a barren land for an empty frontier. They were fleeing political subjugation to preserve their independence, and Iceland, for all its volcanic harshness, offered something precious. A place where a man could still be free, where he could still be his own law, still establish his own farm and keep his own council without bowing to a king. By the early years of the 10th century, Iceland was no longer just a refuge for political exiles. It was becoming a genuine society with laws and governance structures. In the year 930 CE, the Icelandic settlers established an institution that would endure for more than 1,000 years, the Althing. This was the world's oldest surviving parliament, a gathering where chieftains and landowners would meet once each year to settle disputes, establish laws, and manage the collective affairs of the Icelandic Commonwealth. The Althing was not democratic in any modern sense. It was an assembly of property owners, which meant primarily men of wealth and status. But it was a remarkable institution nonetheless, a demonstration that even in the harsh environment of a volcanic island at the edge of the world, the Norse were capable of building sophisticated systems of governance. What made Iceland truly remarkable, however, was not its parliament or its political institutions, though these were impressive in their own right. It was the flowering of literature and learning that occurred there, a cultural achievement that would astonish the medieval world if only more of Europe had known about it. The Icelandic sagas, the greatest literary achievement of medieval Europe, were composed and preserved in Iceland. These sagas were long prose narratives that told the stories of the Norse settlers and their descendants, stories of heroes and villains, of voyages and adventures, of feuds and reconciliations, of family honour and personal ambition. They were written down by Icelandic monks and scholars in the 12th and 13th centuries, preserving stories that had been passed down orally for generations, carried in the memories of skilled storytellers who had cultivated the tradition of saga-telling as a high art. When you read the sagas today, you are reading the direct voice of Viking civilization, the stories that the Norse told about themselves, the values and obsessions that defined their culture. In the sagas, you encounter characters who seem alive across 1,000 years, ambitious chieftains and brave women, cunning merchants and foolish warriors, humble farmers and mighty kings. You learn what the Norse valued: honour, courage, family loyalty, and the desire for a name that would endure after death, remembered by those who came after. The sagas also reveal the Norse obsession with genealogy and ancestry, with keeping careful track of who descended from whom, who was related to whom through blood and marriage. These connections mattered enormously in Norse society, forming networks of obligation and alliance that bound families and communities together. The Icelandic sagas preserved this genealogical information with meticulous care, creating a record of medieval Icelandic society that is unmatched in its detail and depth for any contemporary European culture. In these sagas, we see the Vikings as they saw themselves, not merely as raiders and warriors, though they certainly were that, but as explorers and settlers, as ambitious men and women willing to risk everything for independence and opportunity. The sagas record the names of settlers, the genealogies of prominent families, the feuds between chieftains, the exploration of new lands, and the great voyages undertaken by restless Norse adventurers. Without the sagas, our knowledge of Viking civilization would be reduced to what archaeologists can excavate and what foreign observers recorded about them. With the sagas, we possess something far more precious: the internal voice of the Viking world, speaking to us across 1,000 years with a directness and clarity that can still move and astonish the reader. Yet Iceland was not the final destination of Norse exploration. The search for new lands, the hunger for discovery that seemed to burn in the Viking heart, drove some sailors further west. From Iceland, on clear days, you could see the southern coast of Greenland, a massive island that seemed to promise new opportunities, new lands where a settlement might flourish. And around the year 985 CE, a man named Erik Thorvaldsson decided to seek out these lands. Erik had a somewhat complicated personal history. He had been banished from Norway for killing a man in a dispute and had fled to Iceland. But he had managed to get himself banished from Iceland as well, in a particularly Norse sort of way, for killing multiple people in feuds and quarrels that had become too complicated and violent to ignore. With little choice but to seek a new refuge, Erik turned his thoughts westward. The island that Erik discovered was far harsher than Iceland. Its coasts were dominated by massive ice sheets. Much of the interior was glaciated and utterly uninhabitable. The landscape was one of stone and ice, of deep fjords cutting into mountainous terrain, of a beauty that was severe and almost hostile. But on the southwestern coast, in sheltered valleys protected from the worst of the Arctic winds, the land could support sheep farming and other pastoral pursuits. Erik, displaying the genius for marketing that marks many successful founders, gave his discovery a name designed to attract settlers: Greenland. The name was not technically dishonest. The island did have green areas, verdant valleys capable of supporting life and agriculture. But calling a land dominated by ice sheets and glaciers Greenland, rather than, say, Glacierland, was a calculated choice, an early example of the power of branding and promotion. It worked. Over the next generation, Norse settlers arrived in Greenland, established two main settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, and began to build a new Viking society in this harsh and beautiful land. The Norse Greenlanders were not farmers in the way that Norse farmers in Iceland or Scandinavia were. The climate was too harsh for grain cultivation, and the growing season was far too short. Instead, they built their economy on pastoralism, raising sheep and cattle that grazed on the short, sweet grass of the coastal valleys, and on the hunting and trading of Arctic products that were incredibly valuable in medieval Europe. Walrus ivory was extremely valuable, a luxury commodity prized for decorative objects and religious items. European churches and cathedrals competed to acquire walrus ivory carvings and sculptures. Walrus hunting became a major economic activity in Greenland, worthy of significant investment and effort. Norse hunters ventured out onto the ice, seeking the massive animals, creatures that could weigh 3,000 pounds or more, and brought back their ivory, hides and tusks to trade with merchants who came from Iceland and Scandinavia. The ivory was carved into religious figures, into decorative panels, into works of genuine artistry that commanded high prices in the markets of Europe. The greenish and white Arctic falcons that nested in Greenland were captured and exported to European nobles who valued them for hunting and falconry, that noble sport that occupied so much of the leisure time of medieval aristocracy. Furs and sealskins, rope made from walrus hide, and other products flowed from Greenland into the Viking and European trade networks, ensuring that despite the harsh climate and remote location, the Norse Greenlanders remained economically integrated into the wider world and were able to acquire goods and materials that could not be produced on their isolated island. By the early 11th century, the Norse settlements in Greenland were flourishing in their own harsh way. Farms spread across the verdant valleys of the two settlements. The Greenlanders maintained connections with Iceland and with their ancestral homelands in Scandinavia. The sagas record that many of the most important voyages of exploration were undertaken by Greenlanders, including Erik the Red himself. The Norse Greenlanders were not isolated from the wider Viking world. They were participants in a far-flung network that connected them to the Atlantic world and to the great trade routes of the Norse diaspora. And here, at the height of the Norse expansion into the western lands, at a moment when it seemed that the Vikings had reached the limits of the known world, another chapter of exploration was about to begin. This chapter would be not written in sagas until many centuries had passed. It would be a chapter that the Norse themselves would almost entirely forget, a voyage that would be lost to history for 500 years. But it was a voyage that, when finally rediscovered and acknowledged, would rank among the greatest achievements of human exploration. The Norse voyage to the lands beyond Greenland, to a continent that had been unknown to the Vikings for millennia, to the place that would eventually be called America. But Eric the Red's greatest contribution to history was not his own discovery. It was not the settlement of Greenland or the establishment of the eastern and western settlements that would endure for nearly 500 years. It was his son, a young man named Leif, who would sail further west than any European had ever gone before, who would set foot on a continent that no person of European descent had visited in the modern world, and who would do all of this 500 years before Columbus would sail across the same ocean and claim discovery of lands that Vikings had already found. Section 5. The Voyage to Vinland. Around the year 1000, in the last light of the 10th century, a son was born to Eric the Red in the Norse settlements of Greenland. His name was Leif, and he would become the man who placed European feet on the soil of a continent unknown to Christendom. But his journey would be remembered only as a legend, a story told to children, dismissed by scholars for 500 years as nothing more than the exaggerated dreaming of a seafaring people. This is the nature of forgotten greatness. It accomplishes itself, changes the world, and then vanishes from memory as completely as a ship disappearing over the horizon on a foggy evening. Leif was not the first of the Norse to look westward from Greenland, and this is itself part of the mystery that would surround his voyage. His father, Eric the Red, had established Greenland's settlements with an entrepreneur's eye and a warrior's determination, but even he had heard whispers among the colonists of lands further west, beyond the icy waters, beyond even the sight of mountains. A man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, it was said, had been blown off course in a storm some years earlier and had seen things that no Norse navigator had reported before. He had witnessed a forested shore rising from the sea, rocky and tree-covered. He had seen another land beyond that, higher and more barren but still green with vegetation, and far beyond that he had glimpsed a third place where the water seemed warmer and the landscape promised abundance. The very names of these lands, Helluland, Markland, Vinland, would echo through the sagas like the bells of a distant cathedral, each name carrying with it the promise of discovery and the weight of mystery. These stories reached Leif's ears in the darkness of Greenland winters, when the wind howled across the ice, and the only warmth came from the fire in the centre of a stone house. Something in the tales called to him as powerfully as the sea itself calls to those born upon its shores. The sagas tell us different versions of how Leif obtained his vessel. Some say he purchased a ship from Bjarni, paying in silver or trade goods. Others say he borrowed it, or perhaps built his own vessel in the Norse shipyards, constructing the hull with the painstaking care that Norse craftsmen brought to all their work. We cannot know for certain which tale is true, only that sometime around the year 1000, in the spring or early summer when the ice began to break apart and navigation became possible, Leif Erikson set sail westward from Greenland with a crew of perhaps 30 men. They were not seeking to circumnavigate the globe, or to claim new lands in the name of a distant king, for such grand ambitions would not exist for another 500 years. They were simply following the call of exploration, the same impulse that had driven their ancestors to raid the coasts of England and settle the wild islands of the North Atlantic. They were looking for timber, that precious resource which was almost impossible to find in the frozen treeless lands they called home. They were looking for new farmland where the soil might be more fertile and the winters less brutal. They were looking for trade opportunities, for the simple human desire to know what lay beyond the horizon. And perhaps, in the way that all voyagers feel, they were looking for themselves, for some definition of who they might become in a world beyond the only world they had ever known. The voyage itself must have taken weeks, perhaps months, passing through waters where ice floated like the bones of sleeping whales, and where the midnight sun hung suspended above the horizon, never quite sinking below the sea. The days were endless, the nights non-existent, and the sailors would have lived in a strange state of perpetual alertness, never quite sleeping, never quite waking, existing in the liminal space between rest and consciousness that long Arctic voyages demand. Leif and his crew would have navigated by the colour of the water, which changes from deep indigo to lighter blue as the continental shelf approaches. They would have known the language of clouds, understanding how they form and dissipate, reading in them the presence of distant land. They would have navigated by the flight of birds, knowing that certain species fly only a certain distance from shore, and that seeing a particular bird meant land lay within a day's sailing. They would have known the language of winds in their own Norse tongue, understood the language of waves, recognized the particular swell patterns that indicated the presence of underwater currents. They would have read the sky as we might read a book, seeing in it the signs and portents that would guide them safely to their destination. The first land they encountered, according to the sagas, was a place they called Helluland, which means the land of flat stones or the land of slates. This was likely the eastern coast of Baffin Island, and the landscape that greeted them would have been almost otherworldly in its barrenness. Great expanses of glacial stone stretched across the land, worn smooth by the passage of ice ages, gleaming sometimes in the pale sunlight like the bones of the earth itself. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still crowned with snow and ice even in the middle of summer. There was no forest here, no sign of the abundance that the sagas had promised. There was little that grew except lichen, and the hardiest of Arctic grasses, the plants that cling to life in the spaces between stone. The very air seemed different here, colder somehow than in Greenland, more hostile as though the land itself was warning them away. There was nothing here for settlement, nothing to sustain a colony, nothing that promised the wealth of new territory. The rocks themselves seemed to echo with emptiness, and Leif made the decision to sail on, to continue westward in search of the lands that Bjarni had described. The second land they found was a dramatic transformation from the first. Forests extended across the landscape before them, spruce and pine extending their dark green arms toward the horizon, and here the sagas tell us they called this place Markland, the land of forests. This was almost certainly what we now know as Labrador, a region where the boreal forest reaches down from the Arctic and creates a landscape of profound, almost melancholic beauty. The spruce trees grew thick, their branches heavy with needles that had been battered by Arctic wind and ice. The undergrowth was dense, a tangle of low shrubs and moss, and the earth beneath was often boggy, waterlogged from the melting of ice and snow. It was a place of shadows and stillness, where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the calls of birds. The sagas mention that Leif's men landed here and took on timber, which suggests they recognised the value of wood so far from their settlement in Greenland, where trees were so rare that every piece of wood was precious, every board a treasure. But something called them further still, some sense that this was not the land they were searching for. And after resupplying and perhaps resting from the journey, they continued southward, following the coastline into warmer waters. And then they arrived at Vinland, the place of wine, the land that would live forever in the sagas as a place of almost magical abundance. The very name speaks to wine and grapes and warmth, and the promise of a cultivated landscape. The sagas describe it in language that seems almost ecstatic in its abundance. The salmon ran in the rivers in such numbers that they could be caught by hand without effort. Vines grew wild on the hillsides, and from those vines came grapes, small and dark and impossibly sweet. The winters were so mild that the grass did not die but remained green even in the coldest season, so that the livestock could graze year-round without the need for stored fodder. The air itself was different, warmer, gentler, carrying scents that the Norse had never encountered in their frozen homeland. To men from Greenland, where survival itself was a daily battle against ice and darkness, where winter was a 7-month siege against cold and despair, where the land gave its bounty only reluctantly and in meagre quantities, such a place must have seemed almost miraculous, almost unreal, like the gardens described in the Old Norse myths and legends, the places where the gods themselves dwelled. Vinland was almost certainly Newfoundland, or possibly the coast of what is now Maine or Nova Scotia, regions that in the year 1000 would have appeared to Norse eyes as places of almost tropical abundance compared to Greenland. The Norse built a settlement they called Leifsbudir, the Camp of Leif, and they constructed their buildings in the Norse style, using turf for walls and stone for foundations, creating the kinds of houses that they knew how to build, structures that would protect them from the elements and provide the spaces they needed for sleeping and working, and storing the resources they gathered. For a brief moment in history, hidden away from the knowledge of the rest of Europe, there existed a European colony in the Americas, a settlement that by rights should have grown into something permanent, something that would have changed the entire course of world history. Yet it would be remembered only as a legend, dismissed as fantasy, its very existence denied until the 20th century brought archaeological proof. What Leif and his men found in this strange new land shaped everything that followed, and it also shaped the fateful decision that would lead to the abandonment of Vinland and the forgetting of this great achievement. The salmon in the rivers were larger and more abundant than any salmon they had known. The grapes grew wild on the hillsides, fermented by the frost into a natural wine that required no processing beyond picking and fermenting. The trees were magnificent and varied, with types of wood that could be fashioned into fine tools and building materials, some of them unknown in Scandinavia. There was timber in such abundance that the shortage which constrained Greenland seemed like a nightmare from which they had finally awakened. The winters were milder, the summers longer. The land itself seemed to offer possibilities that their frozen homeland could never match. They built houses here, simple structures of turf and stone in the Norse style, and they carved out the beginning of what might have become a thriving settlement. They stayed for what we can only assume was at least 1 full year, gathering the resources of this new world, exploring the rivers and coastlines, mapping in their minds the layout of the land, making decisions about where to establish their permanent settlement. But Vinland also harboured mysteries and dangers that the sagas speak of only in vague and mystical terms, as though the Norse were reluctant to describe fully what they encountered there. The Norse encountered people here, inhabitants who were already ancient in this land, who had lived here for thousands of years, who possessed a deep and intricate knowledge of how to thrive in this landscape. The sagas called them Skraelings, a name whose meaning is lost now, though scholars have debated its origins endlessly. It was likely not a name of respect, not a word the indigenous peoples used for themselves, but rather a Norse term that contained within it some element of disdain or otherness. The encounters between the Norse and the Skraelings were complex and fraught with the inherent dangers of contact between peoples who had no shared language, no shared culture, no way of understanding each other except through the most basic exchange of goods and gestures. The initial meetings may have been peaceful, even friendly, with trade occurring, the Norse offering metal tools in exchange for furs and other local products. The Skraelings were curious about these pale foreigners with their strange ships and unfamiliar weapons. The Norse were awed by the intimate knowledge the indigenous peoples possessed of the land. But peaceful trade gradually deteriorated into suspicion, and then into violence. The sagas speak of conflicts, of ambushes, of moments when the careful negotiation between the two peoples broke down completely. The Skraelings, it appears, came to see the Norse not as traders but as invaders, as people who were taking over lands that belonged to indigenous peoples. The Norse, for their part, were outnumbered and far from home, dependent on supply lines that stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean. What had seemed like an abundant paradise began to feel like hostile territory. The Norse realized over time that they could not establish a permanent settlement here without a level of military force and a supply of reinforcements that they could not muster. The Skraelings had the advantage of numbers and local knowledge. The Norse had superior weapons, but too few men to make use of them effectively. And so the Norse began to abandon Vinland. Some sagas speak of Leif's brother Thorvald trying to establish a permanent settlement, and of his death at the hands of Skraelings. Other sagas mention Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy Icelandic trader who arrived in Vinland around the year 1010 and attempted to establish a more permanent colony, bringing with him not just warriors but women and children, families who might establish a true community. For a time, it seemed that this colony might succeed. Karlsefni and his followers built larger structures, explored further south, gathered resources, and tried to establish trade relationships with the Skraelings. But after a few years, even this ambitious attempt at colonization was abandoned. The combination of factors, the small size of the Norse population, the great distance from supply lines back to Greenland and Iceland, the sustained and increasing hostility of the Skraelings, made permanent settlement impossible. By the early years of the 11th century, perhaps no more than a generation after Leif's first voyage, Vinland was abandoned by the Norse. The settlement at Leifsbudir was burned or simply left to decay. The roads and paths that Leif and his men had created began to be overgrown by the forest. The knowledge of what had been built here, what had been discovered, began to fade. For nearly 500 years, the saga's account of Vinland remained a question mark in European consciousness, a source of endless debate and speculation. Scholars debated whether Leif Erikson had actually sailed westward, or whether the entire story was fabrication, a flight of fancy born from the storyteller's desire to weave tales of adventure and discovery that would entertain audiences through the long winter nights. The Church wrote its histories without mentioning the Norse presence in the Americas. The monks who copied the sagas translated them into Latin, but they noted in the margins their skepticism, their doubts about whether such places could actually exist. The maps of the world drawn by medieval geographers showed no unknown lands to the west of Greenland, only the edge of the world, where the waters descended into chaos and void. The story of Vinland was filed away in the dusty corners of Icelandic folklore, preserved in the sagas but dismissed as legend, as myth, as the exaggerated memory of a people who loved their stories perhaps too well. The possibility that European explorers had actually reached and settled in the Americas 500 years before Columbus became literally unthinkable to the scholars of medieval and early modern Europe. And then, in the year 1960, a Norwegian couple named Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad began excavations at a place on the northern coast of Newfoundland called Lonso Meadows. They were archaeologists and historians obsessed with solving the mystery of Vinland, and they were following the clues embedded in the medieval texts, cross-referencing the saga descriptions with the landscape, searching for the physical evidence that the legends might be something more than legends. They understood that if the sagas spoke of salmon and grapes and mild winters, then they should look for a location that offered those features. They understood that if the sagas spoke of Norse settlement patterns, then they should look for the kinds of ruins that Norse structures would leave behind. And what they found beneath the earth, layer by layer, excavation by excavation, year by year, was a revelation that would rewrite the entire history of exploration. Beneath the turf at Lonso Meadows lay the remains of a Norse settlement. There were the foundations of longhouses, those characteristic buildings of Viking construction, their walls made of turf and stone, their interiors shaped precisely as the Norse architecture demanded. The Ingstad excavations revealed the remains of several structures, including buildings that were used for storage and workshops. There was evidence of a smithy, a forge where iron had been worked into tools and weapons, a place where the Norse had carried on their trades in this distant land, where they had maintained and improved their equipment, where they had created new tools from the raw materials available to them. There were the remains of their gardens, their storage structures, their daily lives preserved by time and accident in the earth. The artifacts recovered from the site were consistent with Norse habitation: fragments of iron tools, remnants of Norse pottery, bits of bone that showed Norse butchering techniques. And there were butternuts. This detail, seemingly small and insignificant, proved to be the key that unlocked the entire mystery. Butternuts do not grow as far north as Newfoundland. They flourish only in the warmer regions of what is now called New England and the maritime provinces, hundreds of miles to the south, in regions where the climate is considerably milder than Newfoundland's harsh northern conditions. The presence of butternut husks and nutshells in the archaeological layers at Lonso Meadows, clearly brought there by Norse hands and stored alongside other resources, proved beyond any doubt that the Norse had travelled far down the American coast, exploring and gathering resources from lands as far south as what we now know as New Brunswick, or even farther into what would become New England. The saga's descriptions of wild grapes and salmon and mild winters had not been exaggerations born of longing or wishful thinking. They had been accurate accounts of a people who had journeyed into the warm temperate zone of North America 500 years before Columbus, 500 years before any European was supposed to have even imagined that such a place existed. Section 6. The End of the Viking Age. The story of Leif Erikson and his voyage to Vinland was only one chapter in a much longer tale. The tale of how the Vikings themselves would transform from raiders and explorers into something entirely different, how their entire world would change, and how their greatest achievements would be forgotten and then rediscovered again centuries later. To understand why Vinland was abandoned, why the Norse never established lasting colonies in the Americas, why the Western Hemisphere would remain unknown to Europe for 5 more centuries, we must turn our gaze from the Western Ocean back toward Europe itself, to the lands where Viking warriors had once struck fear into Christian hearts, where kingdoms rose and fell, where new forms of power and authority were being established. By the year 1000, the Vikings were already in the process of a profound transformation, a change that was as fundamental to their culture as the change from night into day. The raids that had made the Norse infamous throughout Europe, the lightning attacks on monasteries and coastal settlements that had defined the Viking Age, were becoming less common, less organised, less the central force of Scandinavian culture. The world was changing around them, and the Vikings themselves, even as they continued to expand and explore, were changing with it. A new religion was spreading through the frozen north, a religion that taught peace and forgiveness rather than glory in battle, and a warrior's death in service to pagan gods. Christianity, which the Vikings had once raided in the name of plunder, which had represented to them the soft wealth and decadence of foreign lands, was now being embraced by the very people who had terrorized Christendom. The conversion of Scandinavia was happening slowly, unevenly, resisted in some places and eagerly adopted in others, but it was happening nonetheless, and it was changing everything about Viking culture, Viking identity, Viking understanding of their place in the world. This conversion did not happen in a sudden moment of revelation or divine inspiration, not through a single missionary who convinced an entire nation with the force of his faith. Instead, it happened gradually over centuries as the influence of Christian merchants and missionaries accumulated like snow gathering on a mountainside. It happened through marriages between Viking nobility and Christian families, unions that brought new values and new allegiances into the ruling classes of Scandinavia. It happened through trade relationships that brought Nordic warriors into contact with the Christian kingdoms of Europe, relationships that revealed the practical advantages of being recognized as Christian by the rest of Christian Europe. It happened through the slow accumulation of generations choosing a new faith over the old gods, trading the promise of Valhalla for the promise of Christian heaven, exchanging the religion of their ancestors for a religion that connected them to a wider world. And as Christianity took root in Scandinavia, spreading from the coast inland, from the nobility downward to the common people, the very culture of the Vikings began to transform in visible and fundamental ways. The old warrior religion that had celebrated death in battle, that had promised a warrior's paradise to those who fell with weapons in their hands, that had understood honor and glory through the lens of martial achievement, was replaced by a faith that promised forgiveness and eternal life to those who lived according to Christian principles. The burial practices changed, and this change was visible in the archaeological record, a transformation that could be mapped and measured by scholars. Where once the Norse had burned their dead on ships laden with treasures and tools for use in the afterlife, objects that would serve the warrior in the next world, Christian Scandinavians began to bury their dead in the earth, in Christian burial grounds, without the elaborate grave goods that had once marked a warrior's passage to Valhalla. The art changed too. The intricate geometric patterns and animal forms that had decorated Viking shields and swords, gradually giving way to Christian iconography, to crosses and saints and scenes from biblical narratives. The very way that Scandinavians understood the world, understood their place in it, understood what was valuable and what was trivial, transformed under the influence of Christian faith. Yet the transformation of the Vikings through Christianity is not a simple story of civilization and enlightenment, gradually taming a wild people, of barbarism being replaced by order and piety. Rather, it is a more complex and nuanced tale of how the energy and ambition that had driven the Vikings to sail the oceans and conquer new lands found new outlets, new directions, new expressions. Even as they converted to Christianity, even as they abandoned the worship of Odin and Thor, the descendants of Vikings continued to change the face of Europe, continued to achieve great things, continued to play a central role in the history of the continent. The warrior spirit that had animated the old Vikings did not disappear. It was transformed, channeled into new endeavours, expressed through new institutions and new forms of power. Consider the case of Rollo, a Viking warrior who lived in the 9th century and whose name echoes through the history of medieval Europe like the tolling of a bell. Rollo was born a Norse raider, a man who led Vikings in the conquest and plunder of the coasts of what is now France, who participated in the great attacks on Paris, who commanded fleets of dragon ships and understood the art of war in its most primal form. But instead of continuing indefinitely as a raider, instead of being eventually defeated and killed like so many of his contemporaries, Rollo negotiated with the king of the Franks. He agreed to defend the northern coast of France against other Viking raiders, and in exchange he was granted dominion over the very lands he had once raided. He settled there, converting to Christianity, marrying a Christian noblewoman, and in doing so creating something entirely new. The land he governed became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen, a place where Viking settlers mixed with the local Frankish population, where Norse and Christian culture blended together into a new synthesis, creating something that was neither purely Viking nor purely Frankish, but a unique hybrid. And Rollo's descendants, themselves the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Vikings, would go on to play some of the most significant roles in European history. It was a Norman, a direct descendant of Rollo the Viking raider, who would conquer England in the year 1066. His name was William, and he came to be known as William the Conqueror, the man who claimed the English throne by right of a distant family connection, and then conquered it by military force, proving that the right of conquest was stronger than the right of blood. William sailed from Normandy across the English Channel with a fleet of ships, landed on the English coast at Hastings, and defeated King Harold, the Saxon king who had held England. In a single victory, the entire course of English history was altered. The Anglo-Saxon culture that had dominated England for centuries was transformed by Norman influence, by the infusion of Viking blood and Viking ambition into the ruling class. The language itself was transformed, as French-speaking Norman nobles imposed their language and their culture on the English people, creating a new linguistic hybrid that would eventually become English as we know it today. The Normans did not stop with England. They expanded throughout the Mediterranean world, settling in Sicily and southern Italy, establishing kingdoms there, bringing their Viking heritage to a new region where it blended with the cultures and traditions already present. Norman knights went on crusade to the Holy Land, bringing their warrior traditions to the conflict between Christendom and Islam, and the Crusaders included many men of Norman descent who brought the Viking spirit of adventure and conquest to the Byzantine world and the Middle East. The Normans built castles and cathedrals, founded universities and monasteries, created art and literature that shaped European civilization for centuries to come. All of this can be traced back to Rollo, the Viking raider who chose to settle and transform himself, and whose descendants inherited both his ambition and his newfound Christian faith, creating a hybrid culture that was perhaps the most dynamic and influential in medieval Europe. While the Normans in France and England were creating a new legacy from their Viking heritage, the Scandinavian homelands themselves were undergoing their own transformation. The Christianization of Scandinavia accelerated through the 10th and 11th centuries, with some regions embracing the faith enthusiastically, and others resisting it with equal passion, with violence and bloodshed sometimes marking the transition from pagan to Christian worship. Kings and rulers found that conversion to Christianity granted them legitimacy in the eyes of the European powers, and they used the church as a tool to centralize their authority and expand their kingdoms. Monasteries and cathedrals were built, monks brought literacy and learning to the north, and the wild, pagan culture of the Vikings began to be transformed into something that resembled the Christian kingdoms of the rest of Europe. The change was not instantaneous or total. Pagan practices continued in remote areas, old gods were sometimes invoked in secret, traditions persisted alongside the new faith, but the direction of change was clear. The momentum was inexorable, and by the end of the 11th century Scandinavia had become firmly integrated into Christian Europe. But the end of the Viking Age is most commonly dated to a single moment, a single battle that symbolizes the death of the old order and the birth of a new one. This battle took place on September 25th, in the year 1066, at a place called Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire in northern England. It is a date that echoes through history, a date that marks a threshold between two eras, a moment when the old world died and the new world was born. On one side stood King Harold of England, defending his newly won throne, a man who had seized power just months earlier through the deaths of his predecessors and the support of the English nobility. On the other side stood Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, a man who styled himself as the last great Viking king, a man whose name meant hard ruler, and who had spent his youth as a warrior, an adventurer, and even a mercenary in the service of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. Harald Hardrada was in many ways the embodiment of the old Viking tradition, the last great king who saw himself and his people as heirs to the legendary Vikings of centuries past. He had travelled far from his homeland, had served as a soldier in distant lands, had accumulated wealth and glory through his own strength and courage. He believed that he had a legitimate claim to the English throne, a claim based on earlier agreements between Norwegian and English kings, and he believed also that he possessed the warrior skill and military cunning to seize it. He gathered a great fleet, sailed across the North Sea, and landed in northern England with an army of perhaps 15,000 men, a force that represented a significant portion of the military strength of medieval Norway. The invasion was successful at first. Harold defeated an English army at Gate Fulford and seemed poised to conquer the English kingdom. But King Harold, though he had only recently taken the throne, was a formidable warrior himself and a skilled military commander. He marched north with his own army, moving with remarkable speed, and met Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. The battle that ensued was brutal and decisive. The Viking forces, despite their numbers and their reputation, despite the fame and glory that had attached to Norse warriors for centuries, were defeated. The shield wall tactics that had served Viking warriors so well in previous battles proved insufficient against the English forces, who had adopted their own sophisticated military tactics. Harold Hardrada himself was killed in the fighting, struck down by an arrow as he led his men into battle, dying as a Viking warrior might have wished to die, on the battlefield with weapon in hand, but dying nonetheless, and with his death, dying also an entire era. The age of Viking conquest, the age when Norse warriors could march into a foreign kingdom and seize the throne through military might, was finished. The old world was ending, and it would not be revived. 3 weeks after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, William the Conqueror landed in southern England and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. The English crown passed not to a Viking, but to a Norman, a descendant of Vikings who had abandoned the old ways and adopted the culture and religion of medieval Europe. It was a symbolic moment, marked by history as if by divine intention, marking the end of the Viking Age, the final attempt by a Scandinavian king to seize a major kingdom through military conquest. After Harold Hardrada, there would be no more great Viking invasions of Europe, no more legendary Norse warriors seeking to carve out kingdoms by the sword. The age of the Viking raiders had truly ended, the world had moved on, and the Vikings themselves had been transformed into something new. And yet the story does not conclude there. For even as the Viking Age was coming to an end in Scandinavia, and in the lands they had once raided, an even more profound drama was unfolding in the northern reaches of the Atlantic, in the lands that the Norse themselves had colonised. The settlements in Greenland, established by Eric the Red just 100 years or so before the Battle of Stamford Bridge, would themselves begin to decline and eventually vanish entirely, taking with them the knowledge of Vinland and the western lands that Leif Erikson had discovered. It was as though the Viking world was coming apart at all its edges simultaneously, the sphere of Norse influence contracting at the very moment when it seemed to have achieved its greatest extent. The decline of the Greenland Norse began gradually, imperceptibly at first, a slow cooling of the climate that the people of the settlements did not immediately understand to be a threat. The climate had always been harsh, always been demanding, and the Norse settlers had adapted to it, had found ways to thrive despite the cold and the darkness. What they did not understand was that they were experiencing not a temporary fluctuation in the weather, but the beginning of a fundamental shift in global climate patterns. What we now call the Little Ice Age began to take hold in the 13th century, though it did not reach its full severity until the 15th and 16th centuries. The summers grew shorter and cooler, year by year, decade by decade. The ice in the North Atlantic grew thicker and more extensive, making navigation more treacherous and more time-consuming. The growing season for crops shrank from the months they had needed to a handful of weeks. The farms that had supported the settlers became less productive, yielding smaller harvests, supporting fewer animals. The settlements in Greenland began to suffer in ways both obvious and subtle. The supply ships from Europe that had brought goods that could not be produced locally, iron, grain, wine, Christian religious items, arrived less frequently as the ice made navigation more treacherous and more expensive. The Norse settlers found themselves increasingly isolated from the wider world, connected to it by threads of commerce that were growing thinner and more fragile. The trade networks that had connected them to Iceland and Norway and the rest of European commerce began to fray and eventually to break entirely. By the 15th century, the contacts between Greenland and the rest of the Norse world had become so infrequent that the settlements were effectively cut off from the wider world. The trading ships that had regularly made the dangerous journey from Norway to Greenland stopped coming. No one in Europe seemed to know or care what had become of the Norwegian settlements in Greenland. The settlements had become invisible, erased from the world's knowledge, existing in a state of increasing isolation and hardship. And so the great mystery began, a mystery that would perplex historians and archaeologists for centuries, a mystery that remains not entirely solved even today. What happened to the Greenland Norse? This is a question that has sparked decades of scholarly debate and archaeological investigation, that has inspired hundreds of academic papers and countless hours of discussion among scholars who have devoted their lives to understanding this question. Some historians believe that the colonists simply died out, unable to adapt to the increasingly harsh climate, starving as their farms produced less and less, finally abandoning the settlements entirely as the Little Ice Age reached its worst. Others suggest that the Norse in Greenland did not vanish so much as they transformed, gradually adapting to the conditions by abandoning farming and embracing hunting and fishing as the Inuit peoples did, eventually merging with the Inuit populations that also inhabited Greenland, their Norse identity dissolving into a hybrid culture, their blood mixing with indigenous blood until no trace of their Norwegian origins remained visible. Still others believe that the colonists of Greenland, faced with the impossibility of sustaining their settlements in increasingly harsh conditions, faced with the realization that Europe had forgotten them, packed their ships and returned across the Atlantic to Iceland or Norway, bringing with them what knowledge and memories they possessed of their distant colony, carrying with them the sagas and stories that would preserve the memory of Vinland and Leif Erikson for future generations. We may never know the truth with certainty, for the silence of history is absolute. No written records exist, no sagas tell the final chapter. By the middle of the 15th century, the settlements in Greenland had ceased to exist. The farms were abandoned, the houses left to crumble slowly into ruin, the entire colony dissolved into memory and legend, absorbed back into the landscape as though it had never existed. And with the disappearance of the Greenland settlements, the knowledge of Vinland and the Western lands also vanished from European consciousness. The sagas that preserved the stories of Leif Erikson and his voyage westward were still copied and read in Iceland, that island of learning and literacy, but they were read as literature, as historical curiosities, as tales of an ancient and legendary past. European scholars and historians dismissed them as fantasy, as the exaggerated imaginings of a people who loved adventure stories, as myths no more reliable than the tales of King Arthur or the adventures of Roland. The possibility that European Vikings had actually reached and settled in the Americas 500 years before Columbus became literally unthinkable to the scholars of medieval and early modern Europe. The sagas were ancient texts, certainly, but they were also texts from a people that European scholars had come to see as barbaric, as primitive, as incapable of the kind of achievement that real explorers and navigators demonstrated. And so the greatest voyage of exploration in European history was forgotten, buried in sagas that scholars dismissed as fairy tales, buried beneath 5 centuries of ignorance and doubt, waiting for an archaeologist's spade to uncover the evidence of what had truly occurred in that distant northern land. The Norse had discovered America, had established a settlement there, had explored its coasts and gathered its resources, had encountered an entirely new people whom they called Skraelings, and had left their mark upon the land. And then the knowledge had been lost almost entirely, the achievement dismissed as fantasy, the explorer's memory as vague as a dream upon waking, a whisper of something that might have happened but probably did not. It would not be until the 20th century that the world would come to understand that Leif Erikson had truly sailed to Vinland, that the sagas had spoken truth disguised as legend, and that the Vikings, those legendary raiders and explorers of the North, had achieved something that would not be matched again until Columbus sailed across the Atlantic more than 400 years later. If you are still awake at this point in the story, still following this long and winding journey through the lands of the Vikings and across the centuries of European history, you have discovered something precious in yourself. You have discovered the capacity to follow a narrative, to hold multiple threads of history in your mind, to let your imagination travel to distant lands and distant times. The Calm Archive is a place where history is not a list of facts to be memorized for a test, but a story to be experienced, a landscape to be explored with the mind open to wonder and mystery. The Vikings themselves would have appreciated this approach, for they too were storytellers, passing down tales through the winter nights, keeping alive in memory the great deeds and distant lands of their ancestors, understanding that the power of a story lay not just in the facts it contained, but in the way it moved the listener, in the way it created images and emotions in the mind. You are, in listening to this story, doing what the Norse did, allowing your imagination to travel across time and space, to visit lands both real and remembered, to connect yourself to a past that is as vivid and complex as the present. You are practicing the art of remembrance, the art that allows human societies to preserve what is precious and what is true, even when that truth is difficult and complicated, even when the people we are remembering lived in ways that are very different from our own ways. In hearing the story of the Vikings, in understanding how they discovered America and then forgot it, in seeing how they transformed through Christianity, and how their greatest achievements were lost to history, you are learning something fundamental about the human condition, about how memory works, about how civilizations rise and fall and transform. And so we come to the twilight of our journey, the 100-minute mark where the Norse explorers finally rest, and where you too begin to drift into the quietness beyond the veil of wakefulness. The Vikings have carried you through centuries, through tempestuous seas and unknown coastlines, through the discovery of a world that would eventually forget them, and then through the long arc of history that brought them back to us, into our books and screens, into our very dreams. Now, as the darkness deepens and the world around you grows soft and blurred, we find something remarkable. The Vikings are still with us. Not in the way of conquest or battle, but woven silently into the fabric of every day, into the words you speak, into the ground you walk upon, into the blood that runs through countless millions of people across the world. Listen as the night settles more deeply, and picture with me the map of England, Scotland, and the lands beyond. There are places there whose names carry the unmistakable echo of Old Norse, the language of the Vikings preserved in geography like amber, preserving an insect from ages past. Whitby, a coastal town where the cliff towers meet the sea, carries within it the Norse word by, meaning settlement or homestead. Derby, Kirby, Grimsby, all of these towns end in that same whispered syllable, by, and each one marks where a Viking settlement once stood, where Norse families built their homes and looked out toward the water. Can you imagine the accumulation of these places scattered across the map like seeds from a longship's wake? Dozens, hundreds of place names all bearing that same Norse suffix, each one a small stone in the vast cairn of Viking legacy. And there are others too. Scunthorpe, Thor's settlement in the middle of England, the very name of the thunder god embedded in the landscape. Thwaite, meaning clearing or meadow, appears across the north in place names that whisper of the Vikings who cleared the forest and made homes in the spaces between trees. Thwaites and Thwaite End, small settlements where the Vikings shaped the land itself. Ness, meaning headland or promontory, echoes across the Scottish coast in names like Inverness, Fortress Ness, where the geography and the language merge into a single testament to a people who shaped not just history, but the very names by which we know our world. But the legacy goes far deeper than mere place names carved into maps. It lives in your mouth, in the words you speak every day without even knowing their ancient origin. When you look out the window, that very word window comes from the Old Norse vindauga, windeye, a hole to let the light and air flow through. When you hold an egg, that simple oval of nourishment in your palm, you're holding a word born from the Norse language. Egg, knife, sky. These are not the grand words of conquest, not the names of kings and battles, but the quiet domestic words of daily life, the vocabulary of a people who farmed and fished and built homes in harsh lands. Husband comes from the Norse, that simple word binding a man to his household and his family. And think of the words of emotion, of human complexity. Anger, from the Norse anger, meaning sorrow or grief. Happy, from the Norse word for fortunate. Ugly, from the Norse ugliga, from which meaning comes the word for something feared or dreadful. These are not borrowed words. These are words that became so essential, so woven into the speech of the people who lived alongside the Vikings and their descendants, that they became indistinguishable from the native tongue. They are the vocabulary of the human heart, speaking for generations that no longer knew they were speaking in the language of the North. The day you live through carries their imprint as surely as the moon carries the light of the sun. Tuesday, that day of the week which you pass through without much thought, is named for Tyr, the Norse god of war and the sky. Wednesday carries within it the memory of Woden, another name for Odin, the All-Father, the god of wisdom and poetry and magic. Thursday is Thor's day, the thunder god who rode across the sky in his chariot drawn by goats, his hammer Mjolnir ready to protect the realm against the giants. And Friday, gentle Friday, the day when many rest and the week begins to turn towards slowness. Friday belongs to Freya, the goddess of love and fertility, of beauty and desire. Every week you live through these days, and every week you speak the names of Viking gods without even realizing it. The language of faith, of the sacred, embedded so deeply in the rhythm of time that we have forgotten how to separate the Christian calendar from the pagan cosmology that preceded it. The gods remain. They remain in the words, in the days, in the spaces where we live and move and sleep, And beneath all of this, deeper still, there is something written into the very body of humanity. Scientists have traced it, mapped it, found it in the DNA of millions of people across Europe and beyond. The Vikings, who were never so numerous as some other peoples, left a genetic mark that persists. Their Y chromosomes, the markers passed down through fathers to sons, appear in significant percentages across England, Scandinavia, Ireland, France, and even in the Mediterranean and the Near East, following the routes their traders and explorers took. If you live in Europe, or if your ancestors came from Europe, there is a real chance, a genuine possibility, that you carry within you the biological inheritance of the Vikings. You're not just hearing their story, you might be bearing their blood, their genetic essence passed down through the centuries from a mother or father or grandmother whose ancestors stood on the deck of a longship and watched the horizon stretch before them. This is not merely historical interest. This is connection written in the most fundamental language of life itself, in the double helix of DNA that spirals through every cell of your being. The Vikings explored the world, and in doing so they travelled into the future, into the bodies of countless descendants who would inherit not just their blood, but perhaps something of their spirit, that yearning toward the unknown, that courage in the face of chaos. The rediscovery of the Vikings came slowly, then all at once. In the 19th century, as Europe began to industrialize and forge new identities from the fragments of older ones, the Romantic movement turned its gaze backward toward the ancient and the wild. The Vikings, those fierce and fatalistic warriors, captured the imagination of a modern world that had grown comfortable and was perhaps hungry for something primal. Scholars began to dig into the Norse sagas, to study the runic inscriptions, to piece together the fragments of a civilization that had been partially lost to time, and the earth itself began to give up its secrets. Archaeological expeditions uncovered Viking ships, preserved in the acidic soil of the north, their wooden hulls still bearing the marks of the axe and the hammer. Graves were opened, and with them came the objects that the dead had taken to their final rest. Jewellery, weapons, everyday items that spoke of the texture of Viking life. Museums began to fill with these artefacts, and slowly the Vikings transformed from the shadowy raiders of monastic chronicles into something more complex and more human. Traders and explorers, poets and craftsmen, people who lived and loved and feared and hoped just as we do. In our modern age, this fascination has not dimmed. If anything, it has grown into something vast and omnipresent. Turn on the television and you will find shows dedicated to the Vikings, dramatic series that retell their stories with production values that would have astounded the people of 100 years ago. Go into a cinema and you might encounter films that weave their exploits into fantasy and adventure. Pick up a video game controller and you can virtually walk through Viking villages, sail their ships, and experience something of what they experienced, filtered through the sensibility of our time. There are podcasts and documentaries, novels and graphic novels, music that samples or draws inspiration from Old Norse themes. The Vikings have become a currency of popular culture, and yet, and this is the remarkable thing, this fascination does not feel like mere entertainment. There is something about the Viking myth that speaks to something deep within the human psyche, something that persists generation after generation. Perhaps it is because they represent a kind of freedom that we sense we have lost. They made their own way across an unmarked world, trusting in their skills and their courage and the strength of their arms. They did not ask permission. They read the stars and the seas and made decisions based on what they perceived, not what they had been told to believe. They lived in the knowledge that death could come at any moment, and this knowledge made them alive, made every moment sharp and precious and intense. In a modern world where so much is planned and controlled and mediated through screens and institutions, there is something in the Viking spirit that calls to a still. Not the violence, not the conquest, but the core of it. The willingness to venture into the unknown, the courage to face uncertainty, the acceptance that fate, that weird as the Norse called it, is a force that moves through life and that we cannot fully control. The Norse believed in wyrd, a concept far more nuanced than the simple English word fate. Wyrd was the pattern, the weaving of destiny, but it was not predetermined or fixed. It was something that unfolded in dialogue with your own choices and actions. The Norns, Urd, Verdandi and Skuld, representing the past, the present and the future, sat at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and wove the threads of every life. But you are not merely the victim of this weaving. You are also the weaver, the one whose actions and decisions contributed to the pattern. This is a radically different understanding of fate than the passive sense of being trapped by predetermined events. It is an understanding that acknowledges both the power of circumstance and the power of choice, that sees life not as a mechanical process but as a constant creative act, a collaboration between the individual and the forces of the universe. As you lie here, in the deepening darkness listening to these words, perhaps you might consider your own weird, the threads that have woven you to this moment, to this night, to this particular breath and heartbeat. You did not choose to be born when you were born, to the parents you had, in the place you came from. These are the threads that were woven before your choices began. But every day since, your decisions have contributed to the pattern. Every path you chose and every path you did not choose, every word you spoke and every silence you kept, all of these have woven themselves into the fabric of your becoming. And now, as the day fades and night descends, you have a choice still. You can release your grip on the day, on all the things that occupied your mind and your heart and your attention during the hours of wakefulness. You can let it drift away, like a Viking releasing a ship into the currents of the North Atlantic, trusting that the tide will carry it where it needs to go. This is the wisdom the Vikings have to teach us, not how to conquer, not how to dominate, but how to accept the vastness of the world without being diminished by it. How to acknowledge our smallness in the face of the ocean and the stars, and to find not despair in that acknowledgement, but something like peace. They sailed into the unknown not because they were invincible, but because they understood that the unknown was inevitable. Better to face it with open eyes, with hands steady on the sail, with a song in your throat than to cower in fear. Better to move forward, to explore, to discover, to risk, than to remain safe and unknowing. But they also understood rest. The longship had to be hauled onto the beach. The crew had to sleep, to recover, to tend their wounds and mend their ships. The winter came and the sea became too treacherous, and they waited, they endured, they told stories by the fire and preserved their strength for the spring. Now, as we approach the final rest of this journey, imagine that you are a crew member on one of those legendary vessels, and that tonight finally you are being brought ashore. The voyage is complete, the discoveries have been made, the stories have been told. You're allowed to rest now, to release your grip on the oar, to let your hands uncurl and your shoulders drop away from your ears. The ship is being pulled up onto the beach, and the sound of it is like a long sigh, like the earth itself welcoming you home. You can feel the solid ground beneath you now, where before there was only the rocking motion of the waves. The night is clear above you, and if you could step outside, if you could step away from the structures and the lights of the modern world, you would see the stars, the very same stars that guided the Vikings across the northern seas. The stars have not changed. They maintain their eternal positions, those bright points of light scattered across the dome of heaven, forming the same constellations that the Norse recognized and named. Polaris, the pole star, that crucial guide that marks true north, would have been as important to them as it is to any navigator in any age. And perhaps they named it. Perhaps they wove it into their mythology and their understanding of the cosmos. The Vikings didn't have telescopes or modern instruments, but they had something that we, with all our technology, sometimes forget. The ability to sit quietly beneath the night sky and contemplate the vastness above, to feel the smallness of the self in relation to the universe, and to find something comforting in that proportion. We belong to something larger. We are part of a cosmos that has been turning since before time had a name, and we will be part of it long after our individual concerns have ceased to matter. As the northern lights shimmer in your mind, that impossible living aurora borealis that ripples across the northern sky like curtains of green and violet, like the spirits of the ancients dancing their eternal dance, allow your breathing to slow. Let it match the rhythm of the ocean, that deep pulse that has continued for longer than humanity has walked the earth. The North Atlantic has waves that peak and fall, waves that build and release their energy in a cycle that is as old as the planet. Your breath, too, has this rhythm. Breathe in and imagine the swell of the wave rising. Hold that breath for a moment and feel the crest of the wave at its highest point. Now exhale slowly and feel the wave fall away, returning to the calm water from which it rose, in through the nose as the wave builds, out through the mouth as it falls. There is no effort in this breathing, no strain. The ocean breathes itself. The wave knows how to be a wave, and you too know how to breathe. You have been breathing since the moment you entered the world, and your body carries the memory of all those breaths, the wisdom of all those rhythms. Feel your shoulders dropping now, heavy against the pillow or whatever surface holds you. Feel the weight of your head, that precious, complicated thing that contains all your thoughts and memories and dreams, being cradled and supported. There is no need to hold yourself up anymore. You are held. The earth holds you. The bed holds you. The night holds you. The night is vast and deep and patient, and it has held countless beings before you and will hold countless beings after you. You're not alone in the darkness. There are millions of people on this planet right now who are also lying down, also closing their eyes, also releasing the day and moving towards sleep. And beneath them all, beneath the whole spinning world, there is a ground. There is something solid. There is something that endures. The Vikings understood this. They lived in constant contact with the elements, with the forces of nature that we, in our climate-controlled homes and our insulated lives, have partially insulated ourselves from. They knew the sea, they knew the ice and the snow, they knew hunger, and they knew feast. They knew pain, and they knew exaltation. They did not imagine that they could somehow escape the conditions of existence. Instead, they tried to live well within those conditions, to find meaning and courage and joy, despite the inherent difficulty of human life. They told stories, they made art, they loved and fought and explored and built. They looked at the night sky and imagined gods and heroes and the great world tree that held everything in its branches. Now allow your eyes to close, if they are not already closed. There is no need to see any more. The day is done with seeing. Instead, allow yourself to sense in a different way. Sense the cool of the pillow. Sense the weight of the blanket if you're covered. Sense the faint sounds of the night around you, distant traffic perhaps, the hum of a refrigerator, the wind against the window, all of these sounds insulating you, wrapping around you like the protective darkness itself. All of these sounds are the sounds of the world continuing on, of people and systems and natural forces all going about their business while you rest. You do not need to do anything. Your job for these hours of sleep is simply to be present to the rest. Your job is to surrender. This is the final gift of the Vikings, the last thing they can teach us as the night deepens and the hours of sleep approach. They understood the necessity of surrender. Not surrender to an enemy, not surrender that means defeat, but surrender to circumstance, to fate, to the forces larger than the individual self. A Viking sailor did not rage against the storm. He worked with it, adjusted his sails, leaned into the conditions of the world as it actually was, not as he wished it to be. And in some fundamental way, sleep is like this. Sleep is a form of surrender. You cannot force yourself to sleep. The harder you try, the more you resist the natural pull of tiredness and darkness, the more elusive sleep becomes. But if you can release, if you can let go of the need to control or understand or manage, then sleep comes naturally, inevitably, like the tide returning to shore. Here is the Calm Archive inviting you now to release. Release your grip on the day. Release the list of things you did not accomplish, and the words you wish you had said differently, and the worries that attach themselves to the hours of wakefulness like barnacles to the hull of a ship. Release all of these things, because they will still be there in the morning if they truly require your attention, and releasing them now does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means practicing trust. It means practicing the kind of surrender that the Vikings knew, that fundamental acceptance that there are forces beyond the individual will, and that sometimes wisdom consists in recognizing what can be changed and what cannot. Imagine now that you are lying in that Viking ship, the longship that has carried you through this entire journey. The ship is no longer at sea. The ship has been pulled ashore onto a beach of pale sand, somewhere in the far north where the nights are long and the sky is enormous. The sky above you is filled with stars, and those stars are turning slowly, infinitesimally, in their eternal revolutions. The northern lights have begun to shimmer and dance across the sky, those curtains of green and violet light that seem to breathe, that seem to pulse with some kind of meaning or intention, even though they are merely the effect of solar wind on the upper atmosphere. But meaning and intention are sometimes in the eye of the beholder, and there is meaning in the fact that your ancestors looked at these same lights and felt awe, felt the presence of something holy, something that transcended the ordinary world. You're looking at what they looked at. You're breathing the same air that moves across this planet. You're made of the same elements, the carbon and nitrogen and oxygen and all the rest of it, that they were made of. Time is vast, but matter is conserved. In some literal sense, the atoms that form your body have been here for billions of years. They have been in other bodies before yours. They will be in other bodies after you. You are temporary, but the substance of which you are made is eternal. The creaking of the ship is very quiet now. The creak of wood that has settled, that has stopped rocking, that is at rest. The whisper of wind in the sails is barely there. Just a breath of air moving across the canvas, because the ship is not going anywhere now. There is nowhere to go. The journey is complete. The discoveries have been made. The world is older, wiser, richer for having been explored. And now it is time to rest, and you are allowed to rest with it. You are safe. You are carried. You are home. The waves, those endless waves of the North Atlantic that have been your accompaniment through so much of this story, have grown distant now. You can hear them only faintly, and that faint sound is soothing, is like a lullaby, is like the echo of something that has protected you and guided you through danger and brought you at last to safety. The rhythm of the waves is the rhythm of breath, the rhythm of the heart, the rhythm of time itself, and you are learning to synchronize with it, to move in harmony with the fundamental patterns of existence. In breathing, you are breathing with the ocean. In sleeping, you are sleeping with the earth. In living, you are living with the vast majority of humans who have ever existed, all of whom have also slept, also rested, also released their grip on the day and surrendered to the night. Let your mind become like the Northern Lights now, not trying to focus on anything, not trying to think or achieve or understand, just allowing images and sensations to flow across the surface of consciousness like those rippling colours across the night sky. A flash of green, and then it fades. A suggestion of violet, and then it dissolves. No narrative, no story, because the story is ending now, and what comes after the story is the realm of dream, and dreams are not subject to the logic of narrative. Dreams follow their own rules, their own grammar, their own mysterious language, and perhaps in your dreams tonight you will find yourself on that ship again, or in a Viking settlement watching the snow fall, or sailing toward a coastline that has not yet been discovered, or standing at the bow and feeling the spray of the northern ocean on your face. Or perhaps you will dream of nothing, will pass through the hours of sleep in a darkness so complete that your waking mind will have no record of it, and you will wake in the morning feeling rested in a way that you cannot quite account for, because the deepest rest happens below the level of dreams, below the level of consciousness, in the cellular restoration that occurs when the body and the nervous system finally release all their tension and allow themselves to heal. This is the time for that now. This is the time for that deepening. The hour grows late. The northern lights are fading from the sky. The stars are turning slowly overhead. The ship rests on the shore. Your heart beats its steady rhythm. Your lungs fill and empty, automatic, trustworthy, requiring no conscious effort. You are taken care of. You have been taken care of since the moment of your birth, by parents or guardians, or at least by the basic physics of the universe that keeps the atoms together and the light moving and the seasons turning. And that same physics, that same force, that same order will continue to take care of you as you sleep and as you wake and as you live out the rest of your life. Sweet dreams, dear friends. May the northern lights guide you safely through the night as they guided the Vikings across the ancient seas. May you sleep deeply and wake refreshed. May you carry, in whatever form your particular circumstances allow, something of the Viking spirit, the courage to face the unknown, the wisdom to rest when rest is needed, and the eternal human yearning to explore, to discover, to reach beyond the boundaries of what has already been known. The longship glides silently across dark water. The northern lights shimmer above, alive with colour and motion. The stars turn slowly overhead, as they have turned for billions of years, and will continue to turn long after you have closed your eyes and entered the vast restful realm of sleep. You are safe, you are carried, you are home, and home is where the heart rests, and rest is where the soul heals, and healing is the deepest gift that sleep can give. May it be yours tonight. May you drift gently into the darkness and find there everything you need. Good night, dear listeners. Until we meet again in the next story from the Calm Archive,